Anyway, but we really did have a lot of donations and a lot of fun things that were taking place. Failed to mention it in the first service, but I see some superstars over here. But congratulations to the Helena Huskies girls softball team on the state championship this year. Really awesome job. So excited for you guys with that, and so anyway, super proud of you. We've got several of our girls in our student ministry that are Helena softball players, and so I know you are all very, very, very excited with that. Well, if you got your Bibles, take them, and I pray you do. Take them and turn with me to the book of Acts. Acts chapter 15 as we continue in this series that we have been in all the way going back to the fall. We are simply calling this portion of it the Acts of the Apostles as we see the work that Barnabas and Paul, and then from here Barnabas and Silas, and Paul and Silas and others are going to be doing. And so we're going to be back in there this morning, Acts chapter 15. And I don't always call people out, but Abby Hess, it is so good to see you here. You've been traveling the world basically for the last year, doing a ministry at a program called The Forge, and you've just taken a new middle school associate job at a church in Fort Worth, Texas. And we are so super proud of you and excited for you, and just pray God's blessings on you. And I'm just so grateful to see you here this morning. And I had lunch just a couple of weeks ago with your dad, and Tim and Becca are so super proud of you as well. And they were so excited about what God's doing in your life, and we certainly are too. So just wanted to get that out of my way too, and just tell you we're glad you are here with us today. Again, Acts chapter 15, we're going to continue in this. And to be honest with you, I laid this series out, just kind of outlined all of it back last spring and last summer. And I just kind of went through and thought, okay, these are the messages where we kind of want to land with this. Every once in a while, as we've been working our way through this series, I have added something to it, feeling like God wanted us to touch on some verses that maybe I had left out in the planning process, because we're not really going verse by verse. We're going more story by story through this series. And to be honest with you, the verses we're covering this morning, this particular story, I had left out in the planning process. And in fact, I didn't even go into last Sunday thinking that this was what we're going to do. I thought we would just jump straight to Acts 16 after we spent the last Sunday on Mother's Day in Acts 15 and what was going on there. But as I got home and I just started continuing to read through this, I really felt like God impressing it upon my life and upon my heart that He had a message for us, that He had a word for you, He had a word for me, He had a word for our church in this little story that takes place at the very end of Acts chapter 15. And I started sharing this with Susan earlier in the week. Just what's going on here, and I told her what was happening in Acts at the end of Acts chapter 15, and she looked at me and she said the question that every pastor loves to hear from not just his wife, but from anybody in particular. She said this, she went, well, how are you going to turn that into a message? And I said, well, Susan, you of little faith, I have no idea whatsoever. And so that's just, I want you to know my heart. I really didn't. I'm just like, I don't know why I feel so impressed to preach this. This is not an easy little passage here. It's a pretty difficult passage. And as I've just continued to study it, and I've continued to write and write and write and look at and look at and look at and study and study and study, I've just written so many things down, but I still didn't know how I was going to wrap it up. And that was another question she asked. She said, how are you going to tie this all together for everyone? And I'm just going to be transparent and honest, tell you, I didn't know. I really had no idea. I stayed up really, really late last night. I got up really, really early this morning, not just because of the lightning and the thunder, although that helped, but I got up really early this morning and just continued to just pray and continue to just look at this and tried to in a sense, massage it a little bit. Just where did God want this to land? And to be honest with you, I'm praying God lands it. And I really mean that with all my heart. I mean, I've got it all written out here. I've got the introduction. I've got a conclusion written. But it's really the only a kind of message that only God can bring home to your heart. And so that's my prayer, is that God would just bring this message home to your heart. So let me start just with a simple question. Have you ever had a falling out with someone while serving Jesus? Have you ever experienced at some point in your life what may be called church hurt? Where you were involved, you were working alongside, maybe you were serving, maybe you were ministering, maybe you were even on staff somewhere. I don't really know. Maybe you went on mission somewhere, but you just got at odds with someone. and you experience that. And I want you to know if that's you, and I get it. We all have these certain things that happen in our life. I just want you to know you're not alone. That if you've ever experienced a falling out with someone while serving Jesus with them, you're not alone. Today, we're going to look here at the end of Acts chapter 15 at one of the most surprising fights in the entire New Testament. And it is not a fight between two unknowns. It's not a fight between just two random people in the congregation that Paul and Barnabas have to swoop in and try to fix it and put out the flames. It's not that kind of fight. It's not with those type of people. In fact, it's a fight between two of the church's biggest leaders. In fact, I would argue in the church in Antioch, it was a fight between the church's two biggest leaders. Acts chapter 15, verses 36 to 41, that we're going to be reading from, records a very sharp disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. Paul and Barnabas, I mean, these guys have been together. They've been doing this work in Antioch and taking the gospel to the uttermost parts of the world. And they are up to this point, what we would say, they are giants of the early church. They are missionary partners. They are faithful men of God. And yet when we read about this disagreement, the word for disagreement in the Greek is one for a very volatile disagreement. This wasn't just a few words that were spat at each other. This is a pretty violent kind of disagreement. Not saying they came to blows, but I'm just saying this was not just a little argument that just ended very quickly either. In fact, what we're going to read is they disagreed so sharply with one another that they parted ways with one another. So again, what do we do with a text like this? Tell you what I wanted to do. I wanted to skip over and go to chapter 16. Being honest with you. I think a lot of times we might be tempted to gloss over something like this. I think we might be tempted to kind of sanitize it and say, well, it wasn't as big a deal as maybe what you're making it out to be. Maybe sometimes we want to just pretend that this story and other stories like this aren't really in God's record of redemptive history, and yet there they are. So what I love about the Bible never does that. The Bible never glosses over. The Bible never sanitizes things. The Bible never just skips and leaves things out. The Bible doesn't try to remove the warts of people that God loves and that God uses. The Bible simply tells the truth. It shows us that even those most used by God are still human beings. And I believe in that we can relate with all those things because we've all got warts, don't we? We've all got hurts. We've all got some things, disappointments in our life, and maybe we relate to so many of these different Bible characters. In telling us these types of stories, I believe God is teaching us how He sovereignly works even through our weaknesses to accomplish His purposes. In fact, the Bible even tells us that when we are weak, He is what? He is strong. This story this morning might make you squirm a little bit. It might make you uncomfortable. You might think to yourself, why in the world would Paul and Barnabas argue over something like that? It doesn't wrap up neatly. It's not one that at the end of it you're like, oh, okay, great. There's no hugs. There's no apologies. There's no shaking hands between Paul and Barnabas. There's just a split. But hear me, God still works through it. Because the good news of Jesus isn't that He only works through clean, conflict-free people. And aren't you thankful that He doesn't? Aren't you glad He doesn't just work through the perfect? If that was true, He'd only work through Jesus. But He works through Jesus through the imperfect people. Aren't you thankful that God doesn't work through just conflict-free people? Because if that were the case, it'd leave us out, wouldn't it? Because even though I love our church, this isn't a perfect church. We're not a perfect people. I'm not a perfect pastor, not by a long shot. And I'm telling you what, every church you ride by is not perfect either. Every one of them's got their warts. Every one of them's got their problems. Sometimes the problem comes from the pulpit. Sometimes the problem comes from the pews. But everyone's got their problems. And again, the good news, though, is that Jesus doesn't just work through problem-free people. Actually, the gospel says that Jesus even works in our mess. And when I started to think about what I wanted to title this message, that's what I decided to title it, Ministry in the Mess. Ministry in the Mess. And again, I pray God brings this home to your heart. Let me read the story together. It's just a handful of verses, and so let's just go ahead and get the whole thing out there, and then we'll go back and kind of dive in a little deeper into it like I like to do. Verse 36, tells us this. After some time had passed, Paul said to Barnabas, let's go back and visit the brothers and sisters in every town where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. Barnabas wanted to take along John Mark, but Paul insisted that they should not take along this man who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone on with them to the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company, and Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed off to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed after being commended by the brothers and sisters to the grace of the Lord. He traveled through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. He traveled strengthening the churches. Here we have this story of what was taking place between the two leaders there at the church at Antioch, Paul and Barnabas. I've loved the church at Antioch. I have loved looking into this church ever since we were introduced to them back a handful of chapters ago. I love their heart. I love their heart for ministry. I love their heart for mission. I love that while the Jerusalem church was where all the rules were done and things were decided, and the Jerusalem church was such a strong and it was a great mother church, I love the church at Antioch's heart that said, you know, we're going to take the gospel not just to Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, we're going to take the gospel to the uttermost parts of the earth. I love the church at Antioch because they were a church, I pray like us, that was a church for the nations. I think they were a church for their neighbors. I think they were a church all about the next generation. I think we're going to see that somewhat here in this story today. I love that. I love holding them up as a mirror to our church and learning from them. Warren Wiersbe, who's one of my favorite Bible writers, said this: the church at Antioch was not a parking lot, but rather a launching pad. And I love that description, that they weren't just a place that people came to gather. They were a place that people came to gather and then to scatter, to go and be the body of Christ in their world, to take the good news of Jesus Christ to the uttermost parts of the earth. And in a sense, I read that statement and I think that describes us a lot. In fact, that's why we're the Station Church. If you didn't know why we call ourselves the Station, it's because one reason is because a station isn't a place where anybody comes to just simply gather. No one comes to a train station to sit in the train station. No one shows up at a bus station just to hang out in the bus station. No one goes to an airport, which is an air station basically, just to sit in an airport. Although I have been to airports that I thought all they wanted me to do was sit there because I didn't think the plane was ever going to take off. But no one goes to sit in stations. Everyone goes to a station like that because they're headed somewhere else. And that's why we're the Station Church, because we believe that God has called us here to gather together, but ultimately we are all headed somewhere else, out into the world to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ to people everywhere, to love the nations, to love our neighbors, to love the next generation. I pray that we too are a launching pad like the church at Antioch. What we know about the Apostle Paul up to this point, and what we know about him even from this point, is that he had a great passion to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. It drove everything in his life, the gospel of Jesus Christ. In fact, we read Paul's words in the book of Romans chapter 15 verse 20, a verse that actually is one of our theme verses for our missions ministry here at this church. He said this: my aim is to preach the gospel where Christ has not been named, so that I will not build on someone else's foundation. In other words, for Paul, his goal was to take the good news of Jesus Christ to people who had never heard the good news of Jesus Christ. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 16, he said this: for if I preach the gospel, I have no reason to boast, because I am compelled to preach. And then he said, and woe to me if I do not preach the gospel, if I do not preach the good news of Jesus Christ. Here at the end of chapter 15, Paul and Barnabas are just coming from the Jerusalem Council that we looked at last week on Mother's Day, where the gospel of grace had been affirmed and it had been agreed upon that salvation wasn't Jesus plus anything else. It was just Jesus only. Jesus plus nothing. As we said last week, Jesus plus something equals nothing. Jesus plus nothing equals everything, right? And by the way, if you left here last week thinking, I can't believe that he just went on the Acts series and didn't preach a Mother's Day message, I'm telling you, there was great reason behind that. I thought about preaching a Mother's Day message, but I knew how Acts 15 just so simply proclaimed the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I thought about our typical Mother's Day crowd. And by the way, last Sunday was the 7th highest attended day in our church's entire almost almost 19-year history. And I thought, I'm not going to take a crowd like that when God has set it up on a tee for me to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ so simply. So I preached the gospel of Jesus Christ so simply last week. And again, Jesus plus nothing equals everything. And Paul and Barnabas had just left from that council with the Jerusalem church with that message. It's just Jesus. They saw the church come together in such a powerful way. And yet here we're going to see these two guys that after the church came together, their ministry fell apart. It's been a significant moment, the church at Jerusalem and the Jerusalem Council of Unity and doctrinal clarity. Now Paul is eager to return to the churches that they had already planted, to shepherd them, to strengthen them. And while Paul is such a great evangelist, taking the good news to people that have never heard, we also know that Paul was a pastor. He was a shepherd. And here at the end of chapter 15, we see Paul's pastoral heart, because he looks at his partner Barnabas and he doesn't say, hey Barney, let's go and let's start something else new. Let's go plant another church. Let's go reach these unreached people. He said, hey Barnabas, let's go back to the churches we've already planted. Let's just go see how they are. Let's just go see how they are doing. Let's go let them know that indeed it is just Jesus only that leads to salvation. Let's go check on them. And I believe this is a picture of discipleship. Because a true pastor, a true shepherd doesn't just want converts. He wants to see growth and maturity in the lives of his sheep. Paul knew that the Great Commission to go and make disciples wasn't just about winning someone to Jesus Christ, but ultimately the key to the Great Commission was also in teaching them to obey all that Christ had commanded them. This is why around here we say that we want to be a movement not of decisions for Christ, but we want to be a movement of disciples who make disciples. Paul here models what biblical ministry looks like. It is long-term, it is relational, it is committed to spiritual health. It is about sharing the gospel, but it is also about growing people up in their faith. Paul said, hey Barnabas, let's go back to all the churches we've already been to, all the churches we've already planted. Let's just go back and let's just check on them. And then if the Bible came with background music, before you get to verse 37, you might hear the music start to ramp up a little bit, knowing that here the tension is building. It might be at this point in the back of your mind you would hear boom, 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 because this is what's coming. And you don't realize it when you're reading it, just how dramatic this is, just how really terrible this is. But you see the conflict happen with verse number 37. It says simply this: Barnabas wanted to take along John, who was called Mark. Who knew that was going to be such a big deal? That Barnabas wanted to take along John, who was called Mark. But Paul, verse 38 says, insisted that they should not take along this man who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone on with them to the work. Here we see two roads diverge in the woods, as the poet said. We see two men diverge here, two ideas here come together. The issue, a person. The issue, John Mark, a young man, part of the next generation, who was actually, we find out later in the Bible, was Barnabas' cousin. That adds a little bit of a spotlight on this story as well. He's related to Barnabas. John Mark had previously abandoned Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey. If you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about that in Acts chapter 13, verse number 13. And here we have Barnabas. Barnabas, ever the encourager. If you remember all the way back to chapter 4, when we first meet Barnabas, we find out that his name means son of encouragement. And this son of encouragement wants to give him another chance. That's just what encouragers do. Encouragers always want to help people. And aren't we thankful for encouragers? Aren't we thankful for people like Barnabas? In fact, if it wasn't for Barnabas, we wouldn't have the gospel of Mark. Yeah, that's the same Mark here. John Mark wrote the gospel of Mark. Barnabas wanted John Mark to have another opportunity to prove himself. He was persistent and adamant that they take this young follower of Jesus. I imagine at this point, John Mark would have already expressed his regrets over his past failure. I imagine at this point that John Mark had already made his way to his older cousin Barnabas and apologized to him for bailing on them. In fact, maybe he even made his way to the Apostle Paul and said, hey, I am so sorry. I know that I let you down. I know that I probably offended you. I know that you were so discouraged and you were so disappointed that I kind of left you guys high and dry when the going got tough. Barnabas probably had already heard that from John Mark, and John Mark had probably at this point already asked his cousin to give him another chance. Hey, Barnabas, I know I let you down last time, but at the next opportunity, give me another try. At the next chance, would you just give me another shot? And Barnabas, the encourager, made up his mind on the side of grace. And I want you to know John Mark was extremely blessed to have a friend like Barnabas. We all are blessed if we have had a friend like Barnabas. Then you see the Apostle Paul with his unflinching commitment to the mission. He looks at John Mark and sees him as a liability. Paul saw him as a deserter, and this was a mark of weakness. The ministry and the mission was way too important, and the work was way too demanding to have someone go along who might prove unreliable again. Kind of begs the question, why did John Mark leave them in Pamphylia? What really took place there? And while we don't know exactly, Paul's writings in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 gives us some idea of the kind of situations that they faced when they went on these missionary journeys. In fact, in verse number 26, it gives us the context of what this mission might have looked like. Paul wrote this, on frequent journeys, I faced dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my own people. And by the way, Paul kind of blew it right there, because if he had been in seminary preaching classes like I would have, he'd have learned how to put them all with the same letter, and he would have said, I learned from dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from relatives. He'd have put them all R's, and just alliterated all of that. But he didn't do that. He said, I learned from dangers from Gentiles, dangers in the cities, dangers in the wilderness, dangers at sea, dangers among false brothers. And while it's not on the screen, verse 27 says, toil and hardship, many sleepless nights, hunger and thirst, often without food, cold and without clothing. Wow, that kind of puts into perspective what they were dealing with, right? I mean, we throw up our mission trips here for you to go on. We're like, hey, we'd love for you to go on mission with us. Go to the Himalayas, or go to Guatemala, or go to Uganda, or go to Kenya with us. We're going to provide all of your food. It's going to be there for you. We're going to make sure you don't even have to eat the local food. We're going to make sure that you've got things that are safe for you to eat. And we're going to take care of you. And you're going to get to lay your head on a pillow at night in your own safe bed. And we're not going to let anything happen to you. Please sign up. In fact, you can trust us so much you can send your kids with us to go on these mission trips. We're just going to take care of them. And so many of you say, that sounds just wonderful. I think I'll sign my kid up for that experience. We would never come to you and say, hey, sign up to go with us to one of these places somewhere else in the world. We're going to cross dangerous rivers, and there's going to be lawless men, and they're going to have guns, and they might sneak in our place at night, and they might take us away. But we're going to do everything we can to take care of all of you and take care of all of your children. And there is a pretty good shot that they're going to come home with us. We don't say those things, and that's not really true, but that's what was happening here. Can you imagine if we advertised the trip like Paul just advertised his missionary journeys here in 2 Corinthians? Listen, I'm sure that John Mark way back then was eager to go, but the reality would have soon set in of life on the mission field. He had this fear of the difficult journey ahead. There was danger everywhere. The coastline was infected with pirates. There were steep mountains full of wild beasts and lawless men. As the great theologian Barney Fife once said, it was going to get tough, and then it was going to get tougher. Sometimes people who volunteer in the burst of initial enthusiasm change their mind as soon as the pressures of others' things is felt. In fact, recent studies show that 43% of missionaries today do not fulfill their commitment on the mission field. And the number one reason is lack of an initial thought process and strategy to fundraise and have prayer warriors. So they get out on the field and they're not able to finish what they eagerly wanted to start. It's what Jesus warned about in Luke chapter 14 when he says this, hey, if anyone wants to come after me, let him, and does not hate his own father and his mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. And people hearing those words of Jesus and seeing the things that Jesus had done and the power that he had shown would have said, sign me up. Give me the cross. I'm taking up my cross daily, and I am going to follow you. They would have eagerly signed up, but then Jesus says, for which of you who wants to build a tower doesn't first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, after he has laid the foundation and cannot finish it, all the onlookers will begin to ridicule him, saying, this man started to build and wasn't able to finish it. John Mark is the example of that. He didn't count the cost the first time, and because of that, Paul keeps insisting that he isn't going to take him this time. And the Greek word translated keeps insisting indicates a continual, ongoing opposition. Paul didn't just disagree once, he refused to budge, and Barnabas wasn't giving an inch either. These were very strong men with very strong convictions. Now, I want you to be clear here. This was not a doctrinal dispute between them. This was not a personal grudge between Barnabas and Paul. It was just simply a disagreement about whether John Mark was ready to rejoin the work. But even among godly men, such differences can be sharp. Such differences can even be sort of violent in how they're handled. Don't throw rocks at Paul. Don't throw rocks at Barnabas. Paul was focused on the purpose. Barnabas was focused on the person. Paul was focused on the mission. Barnabas was focused on the missionary. Paul asked, what can John Mark do for God's work? Barnabas asked, what can God's work do for John Mark? Susan asked this question of me earlier in the week. Does this mean that one was wrong and one was right? Not necessarily. In fact, the text doesn't assign blame to either Paul or to Barnabas. It simply records the facts, and I believe there's a lesson for us in that when there is no sin or departure from the Word of God, good Christian people may simply come to different conclusions. And again, not on doctrinal issues. As I said last Sundays, there are hills that we must die on. The Bible is the authoritative Word of God. We're going to die on that hill. Jesus is God in the human flesh. We're going to die on that hill. Jesus is the only way to salvation, and He is all that is needed for salvation. We're dying on that hill. But there are times that on pragmatic issues that we can simply come to different conclusions, and sometimes God uses even those moments to direct His work forward in new ways that we hadn't even thought of. These guys had such a sharp disagreement. Verse 39 says they parted company. And Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed off to Cyprus. And Paul chose Silas and departed after being commended by the brothers and sisters of the grace of the Lord. He traveled through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Let me wrap this up with three words for us this morning, three statements for us. And again, I pray God brings this home to your heart. Number one, ministry is messy. Ministry is messy. In fact, ministry doesn't really take place inside clean, sterile environments. It's why Jesus, when He first started talking about the work that He was doing, He started relating it to fishing. And I don't know if you've ever been on a fishing boat, but they're not clean, sterile environments. In fact, they're pretty awful looking. They stink. They're usually piloted by and captained by people that stink. And then when you start to get all the live bait going, it's a smell that you don't even want to know. And then you start hauling in fish, and they start cleaning the fish on the back of the boat, and there's fish scales here and blood over here and all these different things. As fish just get clean, it becomes a very messy place. And I'm telling you, churches are meant to be fishing boats. Ministry is meant to be fishing boats. It's meant to get messy. It's meant for God to do a work and clean up people's lives and do what only God can do. And when God does that kind of work, it gets stinky and it gets smelly, and sometimes you got to be willing to get your hands dirty with folks. Ministry is messy. And that's what we see here taking place here at Antioch, that the ministry is kind of messy here. Look, Paul and Barnabas, they're the A team. I mean, these are the starters. They're not rookies. They're Hall of Fame apostles. Paul wrote half the New Testament. Barnabas' name means son of encouragement. These are spirit-filled, gospel-centered, church-planting men, and they've got such a sharp disagreement they have to split, and everybody would have been appalled at that. The whole church would have been like, I can't believe that the A-team are splitting up. I mean, they were just thinking so highly of Paul and Barnabas. They weren't like us college football fans today who are sitting on the sidelines, sitting up in the stands and watching the starting quarterback play thinking, I don't know why they don't give the second stringer a chance. They're not like that. They're not sitting there going, you know, I know Barnabas, he seems all great and wonderful, and yeah, he's a great teammate, but good grief, they need to put Silas in the game. You think God's using Paul and Barnabas? Wait till you see what he does with Paul and Silas. They're not thinking that. They're just looking, thinking, good grief, these are our two leaders, and they seem to be like they're at each other's throats. How in the world is this happening? And again, it wasn't over something silly, like what color the carpet should be, but it also wasn't over something serious, like is Jesus really the only way? It was over a person. It was over John Mark. And here's the point. Sometimes even mature, growing, leading Christians will clash with one another. They just won't always get along. Sometimes we act like if we're walking in the Spirit that conflict will just magically disappear. That's just simply not true. In fact, I think sometimes the more you see God at work, the more you might see conflict like this actually boiling to the surface. Look back, Jesus' disciples argued with one another. Paul and Peter argued. Paul and Barnabas, they split up here. In fact, this is the last time in the book of Acts you're going to read about good old Barnabas. His story is not over, but as far as Acts is concerned, it takes the back seat here. Listen, maturity doesn't eliminate conflict. Christian maturity doesn't eliminate conflict. It does determine how we walk through it, though. How we're going to handle it. And these guys seemingly handled it beautifully. We don't see Paul demonizing Barnabas. We don't see Barnabas walking off in a huff and saying, enough of you, Barnabas, I ain't ever working with that jerk again. We don't see them doing any of those types of things. They disagreed sharply, but they didn't destroy one another. They didn't go off and start rival churches or ministries. They didn't call each other out from the pulpit. They didn't tweet at each other, and they didn't post anonymously about the other on FaceScroll. I worked hard on that one. So here's the question for us. When you disagree with someone, and again, this is a relationship message. Whether it's in church or whether it's in your family or whether it's just in your life, when you disagree with someone, do you divide? Or do you honor the other person even if you choose to go separate ways? How much stronger? And I think this is so important because all of us here in this place, I would say 98% of us in this place, we probably come from other places with other church backgrounds, and we all bring that with us into this place. How much stronger would our witness for Christ be if we as believers didn't drag other believers and other churches through the mud? Even if we chose to go our separate ways, if we just continue to honor and build one another up, how much different would we look like to the world to say, my goodness, they must be his disciples because of how they love one another, even when they're not walking together. Ministry is messy, but even in the mess, it doesn't have to destroy. Number two, only God can turn our divisions into his multiplication. This is the part of the story that kind of blows my mind. Even though what we read here was a failure in fellowship, it was not a failure in fruitfulness. Did you catch what happened when we read this story? Barnabas took John Mark and they went off to Cyprus. Paul took Silas and they went through Syria and Cilicia. So now instead of one missionary team, God's made two. Y'all, only God can do that. Only God can take a rift and turn it into revival. Only God can take a breakup and turn it into a breakthrough. You and I might have looked at this and thought, well, that's the end of the dream team. Man, the work here at Antioch is just coming to a crashing halt right here. It ain't going to be the same anymore. They all broke up. They got mad at one another. This group went this way and that group went this way. The youth didn't like the way this was happening and the adults didn't like the way this was happening. There's always a kid running in the halls. And we just can't do that anymore. They didn't just throw up their hands and look at all these things and say, y'all, that is the end of that. We might say that, but God says, listen, I just doubled your coverage. You think it was the end. I just strengthened you. I just doubled the team. God has this habit of using even our detours and our disagreements to accomplish His purposes. And I'm looking at people that are sitting here in front of me today. And maybe without me even knowing, maybe there's a disagreement with you and someone else. It may not be here. Maybe in your family. Maybe at work. It may be somewhere else. I don't know. But I also look at people that maybe you've taken a detour. Maybe at one point in your life, you were on the road, you were living for Jesus, you were serving Him, but suddenly maybe you just got worn out, maybe you got exhausted, maybe you thought, I just need a little break, and you just took an exit road off of that interstate. You thought, I'll get on at the next exit. But the next exit passed, and the next exit passed, and you just didn't hop back on. And you've just continued on this detour away from the life that maybe God had called you. And now you've walked into this place and you're wondering, is there even an on-ramp back for me into the church? Is there even an on-ramp where God could even use me again? Listen, God can take your detours and your disagreements to accomplish His purpose. It doesn't justify my sin. It doesn't justify my pride. But it does magnify His sovereignty, that God can hit straight licks with crooked sticks. And this morning, notice this about John Mark. He didn't stay the guy who quit. Over time, he matured. He learned. Over time, he leaned into the grace that Barnabas showed him, and he leaned into the grace of Jesus Christ. In fact, according to Paul's writings in Colossians 4:10, he became one of Paul's co-laborers. And Philemon, Paul calls him his fellow worker. According to 1 Peter 5:13, John Mark becomes a ministry associate of Peter. And at the end of Paul's life, when he is in prison, about to be beheaded on the chopping block, and he is writing his last words in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse number 11, he says this to Timothy, Timothy, come soon and bring Mark with you, for he is useful to me in the ministry. Get Mark and bring him with you. He's useful to me. Did you hear that? Paul went from, we're not taking that quitter, to I need that guy beside me. That's grace. And that's God. And let me share a great word with you this morning. When we let grace write our story, God will write a better ending than we could possibly imagine. If you'll let grace write the story of your life, and if you'll let grace write the story of your life in dealing with others, God will write a better ending than you can possibly imagine, which leads to the final point, and that's simply this: give grace like you've been given grace. Give grace like you've been given grace. Let's wrap this up. Let's talk about Barnabas for just a moment. Because it's easy for us to side with Paul. I mean, he's the GOAT, right? But I thank God for Barnabas. Because Barnabas took a chance on one who had failed. And I couldn't help but remember this. That is exactly what Barnabas had done for Paul back in Acts chapter 9. When nobody trusted Paul after Paul's conversion, Barnabas vouched for him, and now he's doing the same thing for John Mark. Barnabas believed in restoration when everybody else just saw rejection. And let's be real this morning. Some of you are here today because of some Barnabas that God placed in your life. That maybe when others wanted to toss you aside, some Barnabas saw something in you and picked you up. I get emotional at this point, because as I was writing this message on Friday night, it was about 10:30, 10:45. My entire house was asleep, and I was out on the couch, and I'm just writing this message and reading through this message, and all of a sudden, I get a message through Facebook, direct message to me, and I clicked on it, and it was somebody that I met as a teenager, and I met them actually on a mission trip where God just did an incredible work in my life and really shaped me and who I am today. And I met this lady. She's now a missionary, but she was from Montana, and she reached out to me on Friday night about 10:45 and said, hey, I just don't know if you know this or not, but Sam passed away. And Sam was my youth pastor. That when I was 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, Sam and his wife Betty just took me in, took me under their wing, and just poured so much into me. And I sat there, and I was sitting here looking at this message about Barnabas being this to John Mark, and all of a sudden I just started thanking God for the Barnabas that he had placed in my life as a teenager, just to come and say, I see something in you that maybe nobody else sees. And I'm thankful for people like that. He's not the only Barnabas I've had in my life, but my goodness, there's not been many more important than Sam Culpepper. Maybe you've got Barnabases in your life that you need to think about today as well. Your story, it's not squeaky clean. You've got some broken chapters. You quit on something. You felt big at some point in time. You hurt people. You took a detour that never meant to be a detour as long as it's been. And now you're wondering, is there ever an on-ramp? But God brought a Barnabas into your life, a mentor, a pastor, a friend who refused to give up on you. And you are where you are today because of that person. And you are who you are today because of that person. And now you're sitting here in this room, not because you earned your way back in, but because someone showed you grace like Jesus did. Can I say to someone in the room, you are not disqualified from God's plan because of your past. In fact, don't you ever let anybody define you by your worst moment. You are not your worst moment. God's got a grace that is greater than your greatest sin. Aren't we thankful for Jesus who doesn't throw us away? Aren't we thankful that He specializes in restoration? So maybe this morning God's calling you to be a Barnabas to someone else. Can I ask this question? Who have you written off in your life that God may not be done with yet? Who have you written off in your life because you were expecting gold from someone who at that point was only able to give you aluminum foil? And so you just thought, no, they're not worth it anymore. Maybe God's not through with that person. Let me close with this, just some reflective questions for us today. Again, I told you I don't really know how to wrap this up. I'm just praying God's bringing this message home to your heart. But let me ask you this question. Who are you in this story? Who are you in this story? Are you Paul? Passionate, disciplined, clear-minded, focused on the mission. Boy, the church needs Pauls. Church sure needs Pauls. Are you Paul? Are you Barnabas? Focused on the person. Willing to take a risk on someone that maybe others gave up on. Willing to look deep into people's lives and see something in them that maybe they don't even see in themselves yet. Ready to forgive. Ready to forget. Ready to get your hands dirty with somebody in their life and just help them on their path. Are you Barnabas? Boy, the church sure needs a bunch of Barnabases. Are you John Mark? You failed before. You took that detour. And you've walked in this place this morning wondering if there's still a place for you. Are you Paul? Barnabas, John Mark? Here's the good news. There's room in God's story for all of us. And I'm reminded with Paul and Barnabas and John Mark that God built His church with people like that, and He still does. I'm I'm reminded the cross is big enough for all of our sins and all of our scars, and the empty tomb tells us that our failure never gets the last word. So wherever you are in this story and whoever you are in this story, come back to grace today. The grace to keep pressing on in the mission, the grace to see people where they are, the grace to let Him just wash over you, to forgive you, and to bring you back home to Him. Will you let grace write a better story than the life you're living? Will you let Jesus write a better ending to your story than the one that you think you deserve? Would you bow your heads with me? All around the room this morning, maybe this morning you need to forgive someone that you've split from, or that you've written off, or that you've walked away from. And I'm just going to ask you, if that person, if there is a person like that and they happen to be in this room, will you go to them even now? Even before we stand up, would you stand up and go to this person? Or when you get home, will you go see them? Will you pick up a phone? Will you call them? Maybe this morning, what God's bringing home to your heart is you just need to reach out to a John Mark in your life. Someone that maybe feels unseen, that's sitting on the sidelines just thinking, I want back in the game, but does anybody care? Does anybody see something special in me? Or maybe this morning you are John Mark, and this moment right now is your moment to return. This moment to return from your detour and to come back to grace. Realizing that the gospel is for failures, the church is for misfits, and our God is the God of second chances, and thankfully He wants to do ministry right smack dab in the middle of our mess. Right smack dab in the middle of your mess. This altar is open. I invite you to come. All the Pauls, come. All the Barnabases, would you come? If you're John Mark, would you come? Would you come? And if you're here and you need me to pray for you, to talk with, I'll be right here at the front as we stand to our feet now.